One day before marriage, I was sitting on the floor, and a nun was reading and saying, "Their lips are staggered, and their bodies are intertwined." I remember the priestess whispering about the wedding night walk. As a formal measure, it's a strange and scary night process. The priestess reads it in an indifferent tone. I felt rather strange. It is even rumored that it involves on a severe pain down there, so I simply thought of it as a very annoying thing. However, now for me, it's one of the important means. To establish this marriage, I wish I could get the job done right away. But this man has been postponing them, making excuses since we spoke a few days ago. At the time that Eric looked at her when he found her looking at him and said, "Do you have something to say?" But she did not answer him and continued saying to herself, "Although the man's life is at stake because of the Emperor now, why do I feel like I'm the only one worried about this?" So she told him, "When will we get to know better, and Eric the what?" And she continued her talk to herself while looking at him and saying, "Is the reason why it was postponed the first night because he wants to cancel this marriage? If all the kindness he has shown me so far is a lie, and if he just procrastinates to get rid of me?" And here Eric looked at her and started calling her Mesa, but she didn't hear him while she was continuing and saying to herself, "Or maybe, is it possible because he is not even satisfied after seeing me naked? It doesn't matter that everyone is kind to me." Many anxious thoughts flood my mind hundreds of times a day. And here Eric got up in anxiety as he called her Mesa, but she did not reply to him, and she still continues her conversation with herself while saying, "I need to get married in as soon as possible. To secure this marriage, I really want to live here, being here. Sometimes it makes me feel like I'm back to those times," and that's when Eric woke her up, screaming her name. "Mesa." And when I looked at him, he said, "Do you feel unwell? I've called you many times." But Mesa in sadness lowered her head as she said to him, "Fair enough. Who wants to give their seeds to someone like that?" And that's what I heard from the maid, Malika. And Eric was shocked by what she said, and said, "What did you say? Who dared to say such a thing? Who is it?" Ah, it must be Mrs. Malika with her sharp voice. Now I get it. Then he sat next to her and said, "That's what you meant earlier." And here he said, with blushing, "I've already talked about this before. We still know nothing about each other." But Mesa looked at him and said to herself, "Here he is repeating this again." So she told him what he told her last time, which is, "Are we trying to get to know each other first, madam? In this way, we may be able to quickly relieve some of the discomfort you mentioned." So Eric told her, "No wonder you listened obediently to me that day." Then he told her, "Just because you heard a little of what I was talking about, are you asking me to start working right away?" Then he approached her and said, "You're completely impatient, aren't you?" So I turned to the other side, and he says, "However, I also need some time to prepare mentally for that. It's not something I can do right away. As for what we need to do, let's discuss it tonight." But Mesa looked at him nervously as she said to herself, "That's weird. Does he know what we have to do, though? It will be his first time." And that's where Eric says it. It is a complex situation in many ways. Even the maids who she came with you from the palace. Anyway, my wife wants to sleep with me, but I want to know more about you better. Then he held her hand while looking at her and saying, "Be that as it may, please tell me a little bit about you every night. Then I will do my part accordingly. Do we start with something easy? What kind of food do you like?" Mesa meets. And Eric in amazement said to her, "Cam, this is surprising. I thought you might say cakes or other sweets." But Mesa told him, "I love fruits and vegetables too, and Eric, I always had to eat dry food on the battlefield. Don't you feel suffocated from staying inside all the time?" But Mesa didn't understand and looked at him saying to herself, "What does he mean? Is your house claustrophobic? I've always lived like this." And here she felt confused and said to him, "Eric, that's enough." And Eric in shock told her, "Are you imitating my mother this time?" Then he started laughing at her reaction as she looked at him in amazement as she said to herself, "He seems to like to laugh a lot." And here Eric looked at her and said, "Ah, it's nice to be able to hear you call me by my name. Please say it again." And here Misa looked at him and she said to herself, "It's not that hard," so she said, "Eric." And here Eric looked at her with a red face, then smiled and said, "Well done." Then he grabbed her face gently as he said, "It's really nice to hear my wife's voice. Since you were very helpful, I will also show some sincerity." So he kissed her head. And Mesa looked at him in amazement, and her face was red from shame. And Eric was looking at her with a red face as he said to himself, "This is the first time in which my wife tells me about herself." At the time that Mesa put her hands in place of the kiss, and she says to herself, "Is that all?" And when she fell asleep, Eric was looking at her, saying to himself, "I developed a strong curiosity about someone. She's the one who's tricked a lot of people perfectly since that was a child. Even her walk, she succeeded in fooling me. Even though I saw many injured people, I'm surprised and horrified because she was completely disguised all this time. And I wonder, what thoughts flow in this little head?" Then he lay down beside her while looking at her and saying to himself, "I'm curious. I'm just curious about it. I want to know everything about it." And in a new morning, Eric went to Mesa's room, and she's the maid, saying, "This way, sir, young man." And he says to himself, "And when I got there after I was briefed on the situation, my mother was screaming at the princess's maids and telling them, 'If you come here to observe, simply observe. But if you dare to do anything,'" and here Eric looked in shock at what happened to Mesa, and he says to himself, "But by then the situation has already turned into chaos. Let's know what happened to Mesa." And that's when her maid came to her in the morning and they started saying, "It seems that nothing unusual happened yesterday either. Based on the fact that only this side of the bedsheet is curly, I don't think they even touched each other." And suddenly Malika looked at Mesa and she said, "By the way, about this?" And Deli, "About what?" And here she said, looking with focus on Mesa, "Recently, something seems a little..." And the maid, Deli, "What are you trying to say?" And here the maid Malika remembered the day Eric washed Mesa and said, "I'm not sure, but I have a feeling." But suddenly she came back in her mind when she found Mesa like this and said, "No, it's not something," and the maid, Deli, fair enough. Then she took Mesa's dress and she says to Malika, "By the way, do we meet that person today?" And Malika, "No, tomorrow." And at that time Mesa was watching them well, and she says to herself, "The what?" And here Deli caught her as she told her, "Wake up, we need to dress you." And Malika, "I hope they bring something decent this time." And here Mesa said in herself, "I have a bad feeling about it. That person? Something decent to attend." And here she started wearing it, Deli, at the time that Mesa was biting her lips nervously as she said to herself, for about 10 years, accumulated obsession. He was sending warning signals. And here said the maid Malika, "Why are all 3 pillars of the kingdom like this?" And the maid Deli, permission. "How long do we have to stay here? I thought it wouldn't take long." And Mesa is continuing and saying to herself, "If I don't do something today, it will definitely arouse suspicion." So she looked at them madly and she laughed like crazy. At this time, 2 servants were walking from the palace and they were saying, "I hope the young woman likes this. I wish I could too." And suddenly one of them said, immediately, "Did you hear any strange noise?" And the other strange noise? At the time Mesa was running behind them, they still say, "No," like a cry. And the other maid in astonishment said, "Cry?" And here Mesa was running like crazy and overtook them, so they looked at her in amazement as they said, "That was definitely the young woman." And at that time Mesa was running and she was saying to herself, "I can't hesitate this time." And the maids shouted at her as they said, "Ma'am, ma'am, where are you going?" And Mesa started looking around, and she was saying to herself, "My plan will work perfectly with watching the 2 maids." I can go straight to the stairs so quickly." But when she found a maid on the stairs, she changed her mind and said, "No, it won't work. I need to go somewhere else suitable." So she started running like crazy until she found Terrace. And I went to her in a hurry and she says, "Wow, there's nobody around." And under the barrier, and she stood on the fence and jumped like a mad woman from the balcony, saying to herself, "Flowers bloom, you'll act as cushions." But that didn't happen. So her fall was hard, and she got hurt. So Talisa started telling her maid, was it really difficult to ensure that she didn't hurt herself in that short moment? After all this day of banter, you can't even manage the simple task of helping her dress and bathe together. And that's when Eric arrived and said, "My mother and she, Eric, you are here and here." Eric looked at the maids who felt nervous and bent down and put his hands on Mesa as he said, "This one," about what happened. And Mesa was saying to herself, "Weather feels overly serious." And here Eric said to the girl who brought her with him, "You should be prepared to see a doctor." And the girl, "Do you understand? And this girl is Gila, is a member of the Holy Knights Church." And Eric continued and said, "And it would be wise to entrust one of our maids to the lady from now on." And here the princess's maids felt nervous, and Eric went on and said to help his mother and said, "Edel, you will accompany Mrs. Malika to the palace immediately." And she, "Do you understand?" And Eric, since an accident had occurred inside the house, His Majesty was informed. Everyone can leave now. And Edel, "Fair enough." Then Eric fell silent. But here Talisa said angrily, looking at Mesa's maids, "Dealing with the movements of incompetent people is unexpectedly difficult. These fools, they need a wake-up call to assemble themselves, don't you agree?" But Eric nervously said to himself, "This time, again." Mother again and again. She continues to project her wishes on Mesa, and here he remembered what happened to his little sister a long time ago, and he says to himself, "It was a spring before Rosie's 10th birthday. That very day when she was alone in the forest without a nanny. She was hit by a horse driven by a drunken knight. And Rosie left this world that day. And Mom, she has completely lost her mind since that day, and punished not only the stable boy who introduced the horse, but also the knight who caused the accident from their family, even their grandparents and young children, and the mother imposed the same punishment on all of them, while the father criticized the excessive actions of the mother, and since then, father and mother are completely separate. And today, it turned out that the mother is losing her mind again this time, just like in the past. This is my duty now.